Hello, and welcome to another episode of Readings in Impact Investing, the show that features important readings in the world of impact investing, sustainable finance, development finance, and ESG through the medium of audio. This podcast is a non-profit initiative made available as a public good, and its ongoing operation is supported by community donations. Find the podcast online at readingsinimpact.org or on your favourite podcast platform. Now here's your host, Daniel Rosehill.
Hello friends and subscribers, welcome back to another edition of Readings in Impact Investing. My name is Daniel Rosehill, and this is a podcast which is intended to take textual material in the field of impact investing and bring it into an audio format so that you can listen to it however you like to listen to audio and whatever you like to be doing when you're listening to audio. So today I'm going to be reading a webpage from the Government Outcomes Lab. We have encountered the Government Outcomes Lab before, and they are, let me actually just go to their About GeoLab page to introduce them. The Government Outcomes Lab is a research and policy centre based in the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. We were created as a partnership between the school being Oxford, and the UK government, and we are funded by a range of organisations. Now, the reason I'm mentioning them is, firstly, this is their webpage. I'm just reading it, but they have a really good website that I highly encourage people to check out. They have a toolkit with lots of goodies like an impact bond lifecycle document, a toolkit, an impact wayfinder, and in their knowledge bank, wow, I have lots of good stuff that I'm going to narrate if possible. Case studies of impact bonds being used around the world, which I think is great because I've remarked frequently that I think we tend to get so distracted by how impact finance works that we forget that the whole idea here is helping people, improving the planet, making the planet more sustainable, helping people's lives, and we need that human level. So case studies, I think, are so important. So I'm very glad to see they have some, and they have a resource library and a glossary. So I commend the Government Outcomes Lab for the information they've gathered, and they have this series called The Basics. I'm doing the Outcomes Fund Basics page today, and I think they're doing themselves a bit of a disservice by calling it The Basics because they are quite good introductions to these topics. So today we're going to be looking at outcomes funds, and these are very important, and I'm actively searching for material at the moment that discusses them, outcomes funds and outcomes partnerships. I've mentioned once or twice that this podcast is a personal initiative, but I work for Sir Ronald Cohen, who was instrumental, of course, in setting in all manner of social finance innovation. And this is something that Ronnie is very interested in at the moment, so his interest has kind of rubbed off on me. And I'm interested in these because these present great ways to actually scale up impact bonds. We've seen that the level of impact bonds, SIBs and DIBs, remains relatively modest. And one way that outcomes funds can be very useful is that in the conventional model, SIBs and DIBs have to get their funding each time afresh. They have to find an impact investor, an outcomes payer, and that is difficult. And one of the ideas of outcomes fund that I know excites Ronnie is this idea that they can actually have ready-made channels of capital that DIBs can just tap into. And we've seen that happening. We've seen outcomes funds being used to finance a number of SIBs and DIBs at a time, which is ideal. So this page should hopefully give us a greater understanding of outcomes funds. And I'll leave the intro at that, and let's get into the article. What is an outcomes fund? The term outcomes fund has been applied in a number of ways, but most have three defining characteristics. They are 1. A dedicated funding to pay for social outcomes. Outcomes funds pool funding to financially reward the successful delivery of outcomes. Dispersal of funding is contingent on results. So I'm just interjecting here. We see at the start that there is a very big connection between outcomes funds and pay for success. I just want to mention as well that I've had some conversations with Ronnie, Sir Ronald Cohen. Ronnie prefers to be called Ronnie, so I generally call him Ronnie. And so if I refer to Ronnie in the podcast, I'm talking about Sir Ronald Cohen. But Ronnie has made the point, and I don't think he'd mind me saying this, that outcomes funds is almost not an ideal terminology because it suggests that these are like investment vehicles, when in reality they're vehicles for we've had this conversation a few times. He's thought of the idea pools of capital because that's kind of what they are. And funds implies that they're for profit vehicles, when in reality they're usually not. They are not. And the only overhead is just keeping the fund going, but it's a bit misleading, the terminology, which is why I'm very eager to get these episodes out. Okay, let me continue with the actual page I'm reading now. Payments from an outcomes fund only occur if specific criteria agreed ex ante by the funders are met. Outcomes funds are not investment funds. There is no expectation of being repaid. For example, Bridges Fund Management Social Outcomes Fund 2 is an investment fund and is not an outcomes fund under this definition. So just again pointing out here that this is I would say sort of a problematic terminology, and we're currently seeing outcomes fund being used to refer to completely different financial vehicles. Intention, the second characteristic is intention to issue multiple separate outcomes-based contracts. Outcomes funds intend to initiate and support multiple independent outcomes-based contracts, either directly with service providers and or by co-funding outcomes in contracts issued by other commissioners, right? That was the point I made at the start, that they are great for scaling up the individual outcomes-based contracts like SIBs and DIBs. Third characteristic, they are open to the involvement of impact investment. Outcomes funds acknowledge that to enable outcomes-based rather than input or activity-based payments, service providers may need to access funding to pre-finance the delivery of interventions aimed to deliver results. Sometimes providers can cover these upfront costs themselves, but often pre-financing will need to be provided by third parties. In outcomes funds, this third party may include impact investors. Impact investors provide pre-finance in the form of at-risk capital. Investors will want their principal and a financial return repaid if outcomes are successfully delivered. Outcomes funds allow for this kind of outcomes-based investment to be used. Outcomes contracts that involve impact investment are known as impact bonds. See Figure 1. So Figure 1, which I know you can't see because this is an audio product and this is the limitations of my audio. By the way, I'll put a link to this page in the description, but we have I'll explain what is being shown here in the graph. You have the outcomes fund dispersing money into outcomes-based contracts, and they're showing impact bond 1 and 2. Key stages in the development and operation of an outcomes fund. A simplified operational process for outcomes funds follows 4 key stages. Stage 1, outcomes funding is designated and the objectives of the outcomes fund are established. One or more actors, public, private, and or philanthropic, allocate funding to the operation of an outcomes fund. This is money that will mainly be used to pay for social outcomes, allowing funders to act as outcomes payers. The objectives of the outcomes fund will inform key considerations in the design and operation of the outcomes fund. For example, how many outcomes contracts are to be supported and which metrics will be used to assess the achievements of desired social outcomes. The scale and nature of the resultant outcomes contract projects can be shaped through the administration of the outcomes fund. Some of the key choices for the administration of outcomes funds are described below in section 3. 2. Second stage, call for outcomes-based project proposals. Service providers, social investors, intermediary organizations, and or a partnership of several actors are invited to apply to the available funding with proposals for social outcomes contract projects where funding will be conditioned on outcomes performance. Stage 3, selection of successful outcomes contracts projects. Outcomes funds administrators select proposals which become outcomes contracts to be implemented. Stage 4, payment is made for the achievement of measured social outcomes. If social outcomes are achieved through the proposed service, contractors receive payments contingent on the achievement of specified outcomes. The Outcomes Fund Administrator is the team or organization that operationalizes and takes responsibility for these stages. So an example, a real life example, which I will definitely be diving into, is the Education Outcomes Funds, or EOF. And there's other ones. Certainly in future readings, I will try to find material explaining the operation of actual real life outcomes funds that are already operational. The administrators of outcomes funds need to take a view on what constitutes an appropriate outcomes-based contract or project. Decisions need to be made as to the characteristics of applicant projects which are deemed acceptable to serve as outcomes-based contracts, into which the fund will direct outcome contingent payments. The global landscape of outcomes funds. 17 outcomes funds were launched worldwide between January 2011 and November 2021. So not a vast number. Obviously, this is me interjecting with a comment here. Not a huge number, but the mechanism is getting going. 9 of these were in the UK, unsurprising as the UK is a leader in social finance innovation, I would say, with others in Europe, Asia, North America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The visualizations and figures throughout this report are prepared using an open access Indigo Outcomes Funds dataset available here. The authors compiled this dataset using publicly available Outcomes Fund documentation, such as calls for proposals and expression of interest invitations. Where key information was absent or further detail was required, documentary analysis was supplemented with key informant interviews conducted during summer 2021. We include outcomes funds that have reached operation by November 2021. So this is just a little bit, what would that be? About a year and a half retrospective, this data is. That is, we restrict our focus to funds that have been or are currently open for applications at November 2021. And they have here an outcomes fund directory, a web resource on their website also. The first outcomes fund was launched in the UK in 2011. The Department for Work and Pensions Innovation Fund, and the UK is the host of the largest number of outcomes funds internationally. 9 outcomes funds to date, but note that not all UK label funds are UK-wide and some are applicable only in England. The Outcomes Fund tool has also been applied in Portugal, the Netherlands and the US. Since 2020, the approach has also been applied in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. The outcomes funds launched to date have varied significantly in terms of the amount of outcomes funding available. The smallest outcomes funds by value of announced outcomes funding is the Brabant Outcomes Fund, and the largest is the Life Chances Fund in the UK, 109.6 million. Existing outcomes funds have sought to address a diverse range of social issues. Some outcomes funds are focused on a single issue and have tended to focus on employment, education or health. The 3 largest outcomes funds launched to date, 2 in the UK, 1 in the US, are multi-issue funds that seek to co-fund outcomes-based contracts alongside local government agencies across a range of social outcomes according to locally defined needs. Figure 4 shows the connections between each outcomes funds and the sustainable development goals that each fund pursues. The classification of funds to SDGs is based on researcher interpretation. So I'm not going to, this would be literally impossible to explain or to try to describe. It looks like spaghetti, but basically they're showing how the outcomes funds map onto different SDGs. One outcomes fund has a structure that enables it to operate internationally with outcomes payments capable of being paid in multiple countries. The Education Outcomes Fund, EOF, is an independent trust fund hosted by the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and aims to work with a range of government partners across North Africa and the Middle East to improve learning and employment outcomes for children and young people. Okay, why are outcomes funds used? Outcomes funds facilitate the establishment of multiple outcomes contracts, and as such, the proposed benefits for using outcomes funds mirror many of the justifications that underpin the use of outcomes-based contracting for social programs and public services. Outcomes-based contracts, including impact bonds, are used on the understanding that they can deliver a range of benefits including improved efficiency, cost-effectiveness, innovation, accountability, systems-level planning, and responsiveness. While the potential of outcomes-based contracts to respond to a range of implementation, coordination, and accountability challenges has been widely acknowledged, standalone contracts can be expensive and time-consuming to design and launch, and this has limited their use to date. Outcomes funds are increasingly seen as a route to scale for outcomes-based contracts and impact bonds, but scale has been defined in a number of different ways. These include the value of funding committed to an outcomes fund, the financial value of individual outcomes-based contracts issued by an outcomes fund, the number of outcomes-based contracts issued by an outcomes fund, the number of contractual stakeholders involved in outcomes-based contracting, and or the number of service users reached. Our research indicates that the definition of scale applied to any given outcomes fund may be influenced by outcomes funders' motivation for creating an outcomes fund. Outcome funders generally include one or more of, so this is very important, this is where the capital comes in, central or local government, bilateral or multilateral donor agencies, and philanthropists or philanthropic foundations. Reasons given for creating outcomes funds include reducing the time, cost, and complexity of creating outcomes-based contracts and impact bonds, building the impact investment market, expanding the use of outcomes-based contracting, encouraging cross-sector partnerships for social impact, generating economic efficiencies in social interventions, achieving more with less, redirecting funds away from projects that, based on objective data, are ineffective and into projects that achieve demonstrable and measurable results, accelerating learning about outcomes contracts, and or accelerating learning about effective interventions for addressing complex social issues. So there's actually lots of reasons why outcomes funds are a good idea. These I would say are the benefits, and we had above the varying different interpretations as to what constitutes scale. 5 components for outcomes fund to outcomes contract design. Outcomes fund administrators play an important role in defining what appropriate outcomes contracts look like and selecting and or developing the outcomes contracts that will be funded. Some outcomes funds identify the outcomes contracts that they will fund via a procurement exercise. Others shape and design outcomes-based contracts collaboratively with service providers and other stakeholders. Our research has revealed some preliminary clustering of outcomes fund in terms of how tightly key features of eligible outcomes contracts are prescribed ex ante by fund administrators. These features can be thought of in terms of 5 key components of the outcomes-based contracts that are issued in outcomes funds. What? This relates to how the outcomes fund defines the target policy sector and contractual outcome measures of the resultant outcomes contracts. In some outcomes funds, this may be highly prescribed. For example, the fund administrators may stipulate a pre-specified set of outcomes indicators like sustain employment for at least 6 months in order to trigger a payment for the outcomes contracts. The Innovation Fund rate card described below is an example of this approach. In other outcomes funds, this may be much more loosely defined. For example, the policy sector may be complex social issues, and applicants may have the freedom to propose suitable outcomes measures. Who? This relates to how tightly the target population is defined by the outcomes fund. In some funds, this may be highly specified. For example, out-of-school primary school-aged children in rural areas of specified districts. In other outcomes funds, the intended population to be supported through the outcomes contract may be loosely defined or not defined at all. How much? This relates to how the price per outcome or method for outcome pricing is prescribed by the outcomes funds. In some outcomes funds, there may be a consistent pricing approach, a clearly defined process, or a rate card specifying acceptable maximum and minimum tariffs applied to all outcomes contracts. A rate card is a published, pre-specified list of outcome measures that the outcomes fund aspires to achieve and the monetary value that fund administrators are willing to pay for each outcome. In other outcomes funds, service providers, investors and or local co-funders of outcomes may be invited to propose an appropriate outcomes price with no fixed parameters from the outcomes fund administrator. So very important points are being made here, that the outcomes fund may have a fixed rate card or tariff, right, saying that this is what we pay for the outcomes, and the people who are actually delivering the social delivery, let's say the impact bond architects, for want of a better word, they basically are, it's like a menu, right? The outcomes fund pays this much. You can, if this works for you, you're free to propose a project. And in other instances, the people actually delivering the end social innovation, let's say, again, the impact bond administrators say this, come to the outcomes fund and say, this is what we would need. This is the financial model, the prices, the tariffs, if you will, that make sense to us. Do these work for you? So it can kind of come from either side. When, this relates to how the timing and basis for triggering outcomes payments is set by the outcomes fund. In some outcomes funds, this may be tightly defined. For example, a centrally administered annual valuation of contractual outcome indicators across all contracts will be measured against an experimental control group. In other outcomes funds, service providers, investors, and/or local co-funders of outcomes may be invited to propose an appropriate approach for verifying whether and to what extent contractual outcomes have been achieved. There are important connections and codependencies between what, how much, and when, and these dimensions will need to be considered carefully by outcomes fund administrators. Finally, we have with whom. This relates to whether the contractual stakeholders are prescribed by the outcomes fund administrators. In some outcomes funds, the participation of local co-funders of outcomes, independent impact investors, and/or independent evaluators may be required in addition to suitably qualified service providers. There may also be an expectation for the legal form or sector of the provider organizations. In other outcomes funds, the involvement of one or more of these additional stakeholders may be optional and left to the discretion of individual outcomes contract holders. Some outcomes funds set out an explicit learning agenda and therefore may bring together a range of organizations beyond the formal contractual stakeholders for the purpose of learning, reflection, and future planning. For instance, some funds have set out the explicit learning objective of providing better evidence on the effectiveness of the impact bond mechanism and evidence of financial savings. Variation in design choices across these 5 areas will affect the comparability and nature of the resultant outcomes contracts and may have implications for the extent to which the outcomes fund is able to deliver against its intended purpose. Emerging outcomes fund models. With only 17 outcomes funds launched to date, it is too early to definitively characterize the different models of outcomes fund and to assess their relative impact. However, our research has identified some early clustering of practices around outcomes funds with common ambitions and approaches for supporting outcomes contracts. The models below characterize tentative patterns of activity seen in the market and offer a way to think about variation in terms of how outcomes funds are deployed. There is currently no evidence to link particular outcomes fund designs to particular types or levels of impact. Building on the 5 components of outcomes funds to outcomes contract design outlined above, we have characterized 4 emerging clusters of outcomes funds based on the degree to which the dimensions are prescribed centrally by outcomes funds administrators. They call these outcomes fund defined, versus open to definition by other market actors like service providers or co-funders of outcomes, and they call these applicant defined. I'm not going to read through their models, but that is it's just important, I think, really to note the terminology that they're using to differentiate between the 2 types. Outcomes fund defined, where the outcomes fund is taking a more assertive approach, I think would be a good word, saying that, okay, we are defining the tariffs and this is how it's going to go down, versus those that are more perhaps democratic is a good term here, that they're actually opening to dialogue with the actual delivery actors of services and saying, you guys, what makes sense for you, and we'll work with you. Okay, so the first one would be outcomes fund defined and the second would be applicant defined. We outlined 4 emerging fund outcomes models below. The hollow markers show for each dimension whether this aspect is defined by the outcomes fund administrator or applicants. Policy prescriptive outcomes funds. Policy prescriptive outcomes funds are tightly focused on delivering improved outcomes for a specific and predefined sector and target population. Outcomes metrics, outcomes pricing, and the outcomes evaluation methodology is often defined centrally and applied across all outcomes contracts supported by the fund. In this model, the involvement of a third-party investor is not stipulated by the outcomes fund administrators, but is left to the discretion of applicants. This distinction may be helpful when considering outcomes fund ambitions for the involvement of impact investors. The planned Ghana Education Outcomes Fund is an example of a policy prescriptive outcomes fund. Ecosystem Building Outcomes Funds. Ecosystem Building Outcomes Funds aim to incentivize new stakeholders, particularly other government agencies, to use outcomes-based contracting as a mechanism to drive better social outcomes across a range of complex social issues. They often co-fund rather than fully fund contractual outcomes payments. Sometimes these funds also require the involvement of independent impact investors in all outcomes-based contracts. The UK Commissioning Better Outcomes Funds and Portugal Inovação Social are examples of ecosystem building outcomes funds. Evidence-based strengthening outcomes funds. Evidence-based strengthening outcomes funds primarily aim to scale the adoption of evidence-led interventions and/or to build the evidence base around interventions to deliver better outcomes for complex social issues. This form of outcomes fund tends to be broadly defined in terms of sector, outcomes and target population, but may require outcomes evaluations to be independent or have high standards in the evaluation methodology in order to strengthen and inform future policy and programs. SIPRA in the US, that SIPPRA, and that stands for US Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results, is an example of this kind of outcomes fund. Consideration for future outcomes fund designs. To operate successfully, outcomes funds must credibly commit to paying for outcomes while also opening space for those implementing outcomes contracts to adapt and innovate their services. Googleov and others in 2019, this is an academic paper, argue that this function calls for a particular fiduciary structure, one that can pool funds, create demand for outcomes, and give funders and/or political representatives assurances around risk management. Outcomes fund administrators must assure themselves that these core capacities can be fulfilled across the life of the fund. Fund administrators, either directly or by working with others, must be able to design outcomes funding, call for outcomes-based project proposals, select successful outcomes contract projects, and ultimately make payment for the achievement of measurable social outcomes. So just coming back to something that Ronnie, my boss, Sir Ronald Cohen, has said to me, is that this is an emerging competency that if we're going to scale up outcomes funds, we're going to need the right teams of people who have these skills. And I think it's very helpful that they're kind of defining the skill set needed for the ideal team and what they need to do, what they need to excel at to make this work as best as it can, this model. Beyond this core requirement to administer the payments for outcomes, it is important that those designing funds are clear about the outcomes fund's objectives. If the ambition is primarily to drive better outcomes for a pre-identified policy challenge or a particular population, it may be appropriate for the fund administrators to define key parameters around policy area, outcomes measures, participant, cohort, and outcomes verification approach, as seen in the prescriptive and policy prescriptive outcomes funds, which are described above. This approach may be understood to reduce the per-project transaction costs associated with the development of a one-off outcomes or contract arrangement. Funds that have an ambition to develop evidence, either around the adoption of outcomes contracting or on the effectiveness of given interventions, may focus attention on specified and or standardized outcomes measurement, but mandate the involvement of independent evaluators. The requirement for a high-quality independent evaluation designed to assess the strengths of causal evidence characterizes the approach. Such outcomes funds may be regarded as a test and learn tool by policymakers who may intend to embed and scale effective interventions through more conventional implementation mechanisms at a future date. On the other hand, if the aim is to develop capabilities and expand the number of agencies able to use outcomes-based contracting and or to stimulate outcomes-based impact investment, it may be more appropriate to allow fund applicants to define target populations, outcome metrics, and outcome measurement approaches within broad parameters. The requirement for applicants to ecosystem building outcomes funds typically relates to the involvement of additional parties in the form of additional co-funders who are expected to jointly contribute to the payment for outcomes alongside the initial outcomes fund. By bridging discretion for fund applicants and other parties to tailor the resultant outcome contracts on dimensions of policy focus, outcomes measures, cohort pricing, and verification, these projects may have longer development timelines and there may be limited standardization across the resultant portfolio of outcomes contracts. Importantly, this typology of outcomes funds is emergent. The name and clusters of outcomes funds are by no means clear-cut nor exhaustive, and funds may take hybrid approaches that blur boundaries across the fund types. Very important. This typology, as they call it, isn't set in stone, and indeed, outcomes funds as a mechanism are emerging, right? We're only looking at 10 to 13 years since really this type of model got going. So it's still in its early days, and there's nothing to say that a new outcomes fund might have different arms. Perhaps one arm is more prescriptive, one arm is more applicant driven, and that could absolutely be done. For example, the SIPPRA Outcomes Fund is described as an evidence-based strengthening outcomes fund, but also adopts a co-payment model whereby states or local governments jointly pay for successful outcomes alongside federal government. It therefore also has hallmarks of an ecosystem building outcomes fund, in line with the fund's stated ambition to grow the adoption of pay for performance, particularly in the social sector. In the future, outcomes funds may evolve and develop with alternate, as yet untested, design arrangements. The ongoing challenge for outcomes fund administrators is to pool funding that can be deployed with a well-developed set of fund objectives and ensure that this maps coherently to the dimensions of outcomes contract design. So that is it in terms of that document, and they have at the end here an acknowledgement section, which I will of course read. This guide is based on Understanding Outcomes Funds, a guide for practitioners, governments and donors. Let me actually just take a quick peek at this document. Let's see how long it is. It's a 16-page document. So that is where this web resource came from, and it draws on data from the Indigo Outcomes. And sorry, that document was by L. Saville, E. Carter, M. Eraldi, C. Fitzgerald, S. Tan, J. Outs Villard, and J. R. McDonald. Those are the authors of this guide that this web resource is largely based upon. And we have designated this and other guides as beta documents, and we warmly welcome any comments or suggestions. We will regularly review and update our material in response. Please email your feedback to golab@bsg.ox.ac.uk. So that was really helpful. That's my feedback to the Outcomes Government page team. And the only thing that I think would be useful would be a list, but they actually have it here, I see, in the Outcomes Fund directory. The PDF, and it's also up on their website, so maybe in future readings I'll take a look at those. Hope this was helpful if you're interested in the world of outcomes-based contracting and how outcomes funds, what role they have to play. I would say a very integral role. If this has been useful, please do consider passing along this podcast to your colleagues. Say, hey, listen to this guy speaking to his microphone. It's useful. The website's readingsanimpact.org. That's ORG as an organization. And that basically gives you links to the YouTube channel. You can also find us on YouTube as well as, and you can get it as a conventional podcast through all the various cool places one gets podcasts in this world. Thanks for listening. My name has been Daniel Rosehill. If you have a report or document you think I should read, do feel free to get in touch. public@danielrosehill.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, so feel free to shoot me a connection request. And that's it. Hope this has been helpful. Until the next episode.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Readings in Impact Investing, presented by Daniel Rosehill. If you enjoyed this episode, then why not share it with a friend or colleague? And consider leaving a review or rating to help spread the word. Don't forget to subscribe via readingsinImpact.org or find the show on your favourite podcast platform. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.